This is the digital edition of the DW Global Media Forum 2020. I'm Ben Fajzullin. Today we're looking at the battle for information control. Authoritarian states and radical groups are trying to infiltrate Europe, spreading disinformation about the inner dealings of the bloc. They're taking advantage of the fact that despite rapid growth, the EU remains a community of associates rather than a family with shared values and interests. Are foreign agents changing the direction of the discourse in Europe? How can media makers counteract their efforts? And why do European nations allow this kind of infiltration? Is it purely a question of freedom of speech? These are some of the questions we're going to be exploring against the backdrop of Germany's EU Council presidency.
Battle for influence. The media's role in a European public sphere. Welcome to the 5th online session of the Global Media Forum. Europe is facing global challenges, yet national solutions are being offered as answers to global problems. The political discourse in Europe is being increasingly determined by national interests. But does a European public sphere even exist to discuss these global challenges? A democratic discourse could counter disinformation and populist propaganda. A European public sphere could also strengthen democracy and the rule of law in Europe. Developing this public sphere, especially digitally, is one of the biggest challenges in the coming years. What role could the media play here? And how much influence do the pro-Europe media have in the battle over dissemination of information throughout the continent? Join our discussion.
Our guests today are Věra Jourová, European Commission Vice President for Values and Transparency. She previously served as European Commissioner for Justice, Consumers and Gender Equality. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Tobias Schmid is Director of the Media Authority of the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia. He's also European Affairs Commissioner of the Conference of Directors of the Media Authorities and Chair of the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services. A very long title. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thanks to you. It's a pleasure.
And we also have Hermann Wassermann, Professor of Media Studies and Director of the Centre for Film and Media Studies at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. He's also a Fellow of the International Communication Association. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Good afternoon.
And thank you to all for joining us and all of you at home as well. Let's start with the Commissioner, Vice President. Who is infiltrating the media?
Who is infiltrating the media? I am thinking more about who is infiltrating the public space with toxic information and an avalanche of lies and phantasmagoric ideas which we, the people, have a tendency to believe. So, in fact, speaking about infiltrating through disinformation, it's not easy. It's not always easy to identify, but we have techniques how to do it. We have people who work on it in the Commission and in the member states. We have also cooperating platforms such as Facebook and Google who have good insight, good information about what's happening in their system.
But who are the agitators exactly? Are we talking about certain countries, governments, people within those governments?
We have identified in our June communication on disinformation the actors where we have a lot of evidence about their proactive activities, which mean that they are spreading disinformation and propagandist messages against Europe on the European territory, targeted to European people. We have mentioned Russia and China. We have not mentioned other actors, but we also saw that in COVID time there was a spread of disinformation, for instance, coming from Turkey, to mention the spread of disinformation that you can cure COVID by alcohol, which was one of the examples. So these actors or these countries have been mentioned. We are not able to say that they are managed by the governments, but they are produced on the territory of these countries. And when we speak about Europe fighting against disinformation, we don't speak about Europe fighting against just fake news or some rumors, but we have in mind the disinformation which is produced in a coordinated manner with a very clear target, with the goal to distract the society, to attack the institutions by decreasing the trust of the people towards their institutions in Europe and so on. So we speak about something which is not only what you mentioned at the beginning, not only the battle in the field of freedom of speech, but also it has its security aspect.
Okay, so it's not all black and white. You do mention Russia, China, Turkey there. Mr. Schmid, could I ask you a question? Which media are being infiltrated and how?
That's a good question, and the first part of the answer is very easy. Of course, it's the online environment mainly, and but that doesn't help because, of course, online at the end is everything in different forms. So as far as we know, as European regulators, and we've done in cooperation with the European Commission a kind of monitoring, we can see that we have an increase of problems or issues of disinformation, especially, of course, in the online world. And there we have this as well on the big social media platforms, but also on individual forms of communication, and also, and I think this is an increasing problem, in media formats. They are looking like journalistic formats, and where we will have more and more the problem that viewers, that consumers can't see the differentiation between real journalistic media fact and others. So, but at the end, I think, and there I agree to Vice President Jourová, we've got to see that we have different forms of creating antitrust or fears for political or other topics like Corona or others. But from a lawyer's or regulator's perspective, we have an additional problem that we've got to solve first. We have got to define what is disinformation. Because as you said also in your intro, we've got to take care that at the end, the action against disinformation is not destroying freedom of expression. And that's not an easy task. So we've got to find a balance in between securing the stable democratic systems we have in Europe on one hand, but on the other hand also protecting the freedom of expression. And therefore, I think the first step has to be to get clear which kind of disinformation do we address.
Well, how do you define disinformation for our viewers at home?
Excuse me?
How do you define disinformation then?
I think that disinformation, first we can differentiate between misinformation, disinformation, and coordinated behavior. But I think in the first step, it could make sense to differentiate between the content and the infrastructure. Let me explain it in two sentences. Mm-hmm. If you take a sentence like, I don't know, all refugees get their driving license for free. That's, of course, wrong. And this is a minimum misinformation. But this one sentence is not the problem. The problem is if this sentence is taken by a technical structure like fake accounts or social bots, and it's getting multiplied. Also means that it gets a relevance that doesn't exist in reality. So the one sentence, the content, so to say, is a problem, but it's not a legal problem. The legal problem could exist if someone is generating an impression of relevance in the public communication area that doesn't exist in reality. Because this generates an impression to other parts of population that this is a mass opinion, that this is relevant, and so on. So that's why, from our perspective, from my perspective, or experience, I would say we have got to differentiate, because without a legal framework we can't act. For this differentiation, we've got to take care that we do not destroy the freedom of expression, and that's why it could be a first step to differentiate between the opinion, the content, so to say, on the one hand, and there I think we can be liberal, and on the other side, the technical approach to abuse content by, for example, inauthentic coordinated behavior. And this could be a differentiation, but of course, as we are only the media regulators, we are enforcing law and not designing law.
Only the media regulators. I'll get to that with you later on in the talk. But first of all, your point of differentiation and your point of digital media. I mean, all of this seems to many of us to be quite new. Disinformation is nothing new, but it has certainly been accelerated through this brave new digital world of ours. Mr. Wassermann, is it any different in Africa?
I think we see in Africa many of the same trends and similarities with other countries, although also some key differences. I think for me, some of the points that have already been raised are very important wherever we are in the world, and that is the balance between freedom of expression and the quality of information. Also, the trust that people put in mainstream media is important, and therefore the strength of mainstream and credible media is something that should be safeguarded. But I think also that we have to look at people's usage of disinformation. Why do people feel drawn to it? Why do they find it interesting? Maybe why do they find it more trustworthy even than some other sources of information? And what social and cultural factors are there that promote the spreading of this misinformation? So I think it is important that we look at the platforms, that we look at the regulation, the policies, and these things that have already been mentioned, but that we also do a good study and try to get a good understanding of people's behaviors and what are the drivers for the spread and the consumption of misinformation. And some of the research that we've done on the African continent seem to resonate with some of the other studies that have been done internationally in terms of why people share it. And political disinformation, to come back to the concept of, or the question of who is interfering, who is meddling in this information landscape, geopolitical and political factors do seem to play an important role when people decide when to consume and share misinformation.
Of course, the likes and clicks can come for free, but there has to be a financial driver of this disinformation. Can any of you tell me what are they spending? What are these agitators or governments or groups actually spending to get that disinformation out there?
I have some figures here, but before that, I would like to add something. Can you hear me?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add something on what has just been said about the need to differentiate between misinformation and disinformation. We will work by the end of the year as the European Commission on two pieces of legislation. One is the Digital Services Act, where we want to address the problem of illegal content. And this is neither disinformation nor misinformation. This is terrorist content, this is extremism, this is child pornography, this is hate speech. Mm-hmm. And in Europe, this will be done by or through the Digital Services Act, which will be the legislation increasing the responsibility of the platforms for the content. The second piece of work will be the European Democracy Action Plan, where we will try to calibrate and define very well what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And instead of focusing on the content or even introducing some kind of censorship, which was never my plan, we want to focus on the things which you have just spoken about we will will focus on more transparency. We will focus on the channels, on the behavior of the actors, and also on the algorithms, because the algorithms which are used for selling the products to consumers, when they are used for selling the politicians to citizens, it's pretty dangerous method in my view. So the aim of the European Democracy Action Plan is to come with the principles and new methods how to protect elections. But coming back to your money question, we don't have very reliable figures on China's propaganda spending, but there is some estimate from 2017 which says that China was spending as much as 10 billion US dollars per year on enhancing its soft power and their good image in the world. Earlier in 2009, China announced it would spend around 6.6 billion US dollars strengthening its global media presence. In COVID time, we saw enhanced activity. We saw a lot of propaganda from China, which tried to sell the Europeans the idea that their governance model is able to manage the corona crisis better than democracies, which we found very, very dangerous and exactly undermining the trust of many Europeans in their democratic institutions. As for Russia, the Russian Federation spends on state-funded media more than €1 billion a year, according to the official federal budget of Russian Federation, which includes media operating globally and frequently spreading disinformation, as we have officially identified. For instance, Russia Today or Sputnik and TV channels operating in Russian language. Then the famous Troll Factory, which has been active before very important elections, such as presidential elections in US in 2016. Whenever we speak about these high amounts which have been invested in China and Russia, I've been asked very often how much European Union is investing.
That was going to be my next question.
I can imagine. That's why I am proactive on that. We don't want to compare it because first, we are democracies not using the same techniques. We don't have state-controlled media. And we are not one state. We are 27 member states, and each of the member states have their sources. We have the rapid alert system, which is, I think, invaluable. We cannot calculate the amount of money behind that because it means that we cooperate in Europe. The platforms, the Commission, and the External Action Service of the EU, each member state at their capacities. I value this cooperation very much because I believe that this can bring fruits. As for the External Action Service, we have for 2020 the budget allocated for the disinformation work around €6 million, and we will be increasing the budget.
There is, of course, state-funded media in Europe, and there's also state aid for local media, which is happening, for example, in Denmark. How is that different to, say, the situation in Hungary, would you say?
It is still a question for me.
Yes, yes.
Yes, you are right. I was not precise because we have different models in different states, and in some states, such as in Hungary, there is the television which is funded by the state, and it's in such states which have this model. We would like to see a stronger independent media which are able to counter the let's say the official version of the truth, if I can use this expression. And we saw in the latest media pluralism monitor that we have a negative trend in some member states of Europe, including Hungary, that the political influence on the content is increased, and it also covers the state media, such as state television or state radio.
A question for all of you. James from the UK wrote in asking, why do you criticise broadcasters like RT or TRT when Western broadcasters also have their own political agendas?
I can give an answer from the regulatory perspective, if this is helpful. And I can explain it with the German media regulation system, and that's very simple. It is getting, and here I again agree totally to Vice President Jourová, the relevant effect is independency from the state. So a broadcaster has got to be independent from the state, and that means directly. So, for example, public finance broadcasters in the most European countries are not financed direct by the state. It's an indirect system. And that means, in the example of RT, for example, that there you have an independent company, but the content is more or less obvious coming state financed, and that's why it's against the principle of independency of media, and that is one of the, it's so to say, the DNA of a democratic media society, and that's the reason why we are skeptical against media if it is financed by states. But, and here we also have got to be clear, that differs in between the European member states. So we have member states where it is nevertheless allowed, and we have others where we say state-financed media is, in general, nothing that is foreseen in the national regulatory framework, but this is now too detailed, I think. But just try to answer your question.
What about DW?
Yeah, very interesting question. This is, I think, in this case, we have the situation where DW is the try to inform in other countries about the cultural effects in the state by itself. But, for example, we differentiate in Germany between the state-financed DW and the public broadcasters in general. The public broadcasters like ARD and ZDF are financed by a fee directly paid, and that's why you can see it also internally. And DW has an external action, but as we know, this is mainly driven by explaining and supporting journalistic independency over there. But of course, it's a point you can discuss.
I just want to mention at this point, you can write to us if you're watching from home during this session with any questions that you may have for our guests. Viewers from around the world are watching right now, and we've been getting comments from the US, Germany, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Netherlands, India, and my home country, Australia. If you're just joining the discussion, we're talking about the battle for information control. Our guests, the European Commission's Věra Jourová, also the German media regulator Tobias Schmid, and the University of Cape Town's Hermann Wassermann. Vice President, give us an example of media infiltration that you think could interest people.
Can you define what you mean by infiltration? Because I'd like to be as precise as possible in my answer, but...
An example of disinformation that was broadcast or through online media that has managed to reach people and managed to become opinion, or managed to trend online and has picked up a lot of attention, basically.
So regarding, we spoke about China. In March, in April, there was a lot of pressure imposed on the people to make them believe that the European Union is not capable to solve the problem of corona crisis, which was not true. All the member states did their best to tackle with the uneasy situation. And it simply was not true that China was the only state or system which was capable of managing the crisis. So it was one of them. More technically, now the disinformation against vaccine and vaccination is on the rise, which might pose a big problem, because you know that we try to live with COVID, but we would really like to get rid of it. And the only reliable way to do that is to have well tested and well proven vaccination, which will help us to stop the crisis and to come back to normal life. But the disinformation against vaccination is now being spread, and already I saw some survey that around 20% of Germans believe that vaccination is harmful and that they should avoid it. So just these two examples from the recent weeks.
And a very good example portraying how dangerous disinformation or misinformation can become. Mr. Schmid, a question for you. Some have referred to the COVID pandemic as an infodemic. Why are there such disparities in public opinion and so many conspiracy theories out there?
That's it's a question as easy as the Deutsche Welle question, but I don't know, because of course as a lawyer or regulator I can't answer it in detail, and one of the answers could be that a society where we have transparency in the most areas, it's extremely fascinating to get back to the ideas of conspiracy. But to take the question serious, I think what we've got to realize, and that's the real problem of disinformation, is that, of course, if you are interested in destabilize societies, it's not unclever to take topics that are not obviously in the first step political questions, but you can take fears in general. And of course, the COVID discussion is a discussion about fear, and it's a discussion about the right way of reaction in democracy. And it shows us, on the other side, I think, again, the very challenging situation we have to realize, because, of course, this discussion, most parts of this discussion are completely legal. You can have different opinions to COVID, and you can have different opinions to the question, what are the appropriate measures to act with this virus? And you see that for us, for the regulators, for the legislators, for the society, it's not easy to find the right way of reaction on that. Because, of course, we have to learn more and more that democratic discussions can be very controversial, sometimes destructive. And I think we've got to figure out what the right level of reaction is. And here I would like to come back to one point that Vice President Jourová pointed out, and I think there is 100% support of all national regulators for the two central projects we have in Europe, the DSA and the European Democracy Action Plan, because those are the chance for Europe to take a leading role in solving these problems, because it's not only a European problem. Obviously, we have these discussions in all areas of the world, and it's a phenomenon of the new online and globalized media society, of course. But who can solve it? And I think here comes Europe in a very special role, because we have the experience in handling different kinds of culture, different kinds of democratic systems, different kinds of so to say, ways of discussion. That's one core element of being European. And I think to bring now the idea of a democratic, of a constitutional freedom into the online world, and to say we will find the right balance in between protecting freedom and tolerance, also to opinions that seem to be a bit strange or also aggressive on the one hand, but on the other hand, bringing this back into a constitutional idea of behaving to each other. That's, I think, a central chance that only Europe can take with European experience and history. And I think here the European Commission and the European institutions have a real challenge, but also a real chance to give the new media environment, so to say, a democratic and European attitude.
Mr. Wassermann, the online debate really heated up over Madagascar's herbal tonic for the coronavirus. What did you think about that debate? The president endorsed it, but it failed to halt a COVID spike.
Yes, I think what we've seen in the coronavirus crisis is one of the main reasons for disinformation to flourish is when people are worried, when they are uncertain, when there is a threat. So there are high levels of anxiety at the moment. And then I think in these contexts, people are often willing to grasp at straws. When somebody promises a miracle cure, or when there is a conspiracy theory about who is promoting and spreading the virus. We've seen the misinformation around the 5G towers, and that was also quite prevalent in Europe. I think when people are anxious, then they are more likely to believe these theories, and they're more likely to spread it. And one of the things that we've seen in our research is that people do this even if they think it might not be true. They still share this misinformation just out of a misplaced sense of civic duty. They think it is their duty to warn other people about this. And I think this is where the role of established and credible media are so important. It's very important that people know where to turn to when there's uncertainty and where they can find authoritative sources of information. But I think it is also important that we acknowledge the role of citizens in the media, and that they are not only passive receivers of media, but they should be empowered to also make critical decisions. I think this comes back to an earlier question also in terms of soft power and various competing soft powers. And if we look at the African continent, for instance, we've seen historically many different international role players in the media landscape here. We've seen European and American, now of late also Chinese soft power on the continent and in the media landscape. And I don't have an answer for that. And I think it is important. I think it is that we realize that citizens should be critical, and that they should also be empowered through media literacy to make critical decisions and to know which information to trust and which not to trust.
And not always to trust that digital voice that answers everything for you. Mr. Wassermann, I've got another question for you in a moment. First of all, let's just have a look at a viewer question that's come in. How can we differentiate between real content and false information? That's a question coming from Pakistan, from Said Jamshid Ahmed from Pakistan. Good question. Who'd like to answer that one?
I can try.
Try away.
I think we have two different methods. The first and most established method, of course, is fact-checking. And we have done good experience in different European markets with fact-checkers, with independent fact-checkers, to figure out if the base information that is transported is true or untrue. So that's part one of the answer. Part two is that, of course, it is not easy to differentiate between information and opinion. And that's why I come back to the idea to say maybe it is, in the first step, of course, a matter of transparency to differentiate also from the people that send out information. And second, it could be up to us to differentiate depending to the method of distribution. Sorry, it's a bit too complicated. I try to make it easier. I think we've got to differentiate if we are taking a look on information coming from, so to say, journalistic media or from individuals. And if we are talking about individual opinions, then we are mainly talking about opinion and not information. And in the journalistic surrounding or environment, we've got to have another standard. And there, I think, one point to make it clear if it's information or opinion is making it transparent if it's a comment or if it's an information. So that's why first, fact-checking, that's something out of regulation. That's something society can do and has to do, and we've got to support it as often as we can. And the second is, again, differentiate between the different kinds of disinformation that we are talking about, to take care that we are concentrating on the relevant parts of information and the question if they are true or not.
Yeah, well,
it's not that easy.
there's a reason why fact-checking was drummed into us at journalism school, and there's a reason why in newspapers you have the news and then you have an opinion section. But it is something that has been lost on many individuals who've decided that they can also be journalists. And it's, as the Commissioner said, a dangerous situation. I'd like to return to Mr. Wassermann. Tell us about your study, Motivations for Sharing Misinformation. What were some of the interesting findings? Mr. Wassermann, can you hear me? Okay, we've lost Mr. Wassermann for a second. We'll return to that in a second. Let's move on to another question from our viewers. This one coming from the Philippines, from Cyril. He has a question for Mr. Wassermann as well, which is going to be difficult if he can't hear us. But maybe... No, he still can't hear us. I'll have to return to that in a second. Mr. Schmid, let me come back to you. Because your press officer told me disinformation is a big issue, but that you can't do a lot about that. Well, why is that?
That's very simple. That's the separation of power system. So we have legislator, they decide what the law is, and we are then an executive institution as regulators, so we are enforcing law but not designing. So as a regulator, I can only use the legal framework I have, or we have. And indeed, for disinformation, at the moment, there is no legal framework in total. As Commissioner Jourová said, the European Commission is thinking about two different projects. The first is not so much about disinformation, it's more about illegal content and hate speech, another problem, the DSA. And then we hope that the European Democracy Action Plan will help us to develop also some ideas or rules for the part of disinformation. But as long as we do not have this, of course, we can only monitor, we can invest and support in media literacy. But I think it would be a good idea to define what we should do and what not, because of two reasons. First, at the moment, we are asking mainly the platforms to take care of that. And I would like to underline that especially the bigger platforms are very engaged in that, also the US platforms. And I like this as a part of a democratic society. But as a regulator, I've got to say, you know, at the end, I'm a real fan of the idea that the rules are coming from the population via the parliaments, and that we have at the end law and not only, so to say, commitments from companies. Because the legitimation of rules coming from the population via the parliaments and legislators, I think, seems the more European and the more stable way. And that's why I think at the end, it's not a solution to ask companies to implement standards. They are supportive and I like it, but that's not the solution. Okay. Second point, I think it's possible to find rules. We have one interesting example in Germany. There we have a rule in the next media law coming up this autumn, and that says if, for example, there are journalistic media also online that are not respecting the rules of journalistic work, for example, as we discussed 2 minutes ago, the differentiation between opinion and information, then the media regulator or a self-regulatory body can intervene and can take care that this media has got to work more solid on that. It's a rule coming out of the old world from broadcasting in newspapers, and then the German legislator said, why not also in the online environment? And I think this is one example where we have, of course, it's just one little stone in the whole picture, but it's one first opportunity also for the regulators or the self-regulatory bodies to intervene against concrete forms of disinformation or misinformation. And I think to take this idea and to think about where we find other points, mainly concentrated on mechanisms, on mechanics, on distribution, on algorithm, like Commissioner Jourová said, would be helpful. And then if we would have a legal environment, if we would have a legal framework, then of course we can get active, because that is what we are there for. That's the idea of media regulators. But of course, we need legal framework for that.
Can you just explain to me really briefly why the legal framework isn't there? I mean, WhatsApp has been around for over a decade, and Facebook was launched 16 years ago.
I think, very briefly, it's funny, yes. I think that if you take the Industrial Revolution in 1900, I think it took, when I'm right informed, about 30 years until we get the first fitting legal framework to securing the rights of employees, for example. So it's normal that it needs a little bit time. And I think the issue of disinformation also is something that is not existing in this tremendous range like we have it now since 10 years. It's a phenomenon that we have since 3, 4, 5 years, mainly since 2 or 3 years. And European Commission took action with the Code of Practice and the action plan. So we have done the first steps. We have done the monitoring by ERGA, to the European regulatory groups for audiovisual media, to make clear that this is an increasing problem. And now there comes the next step. And that's the normal procedure. So I think, to be absolutely honest, the question, why haven't we done it in the past, is a good one, but it doesn't help. I think what helps is that we can do it now. And I think, of course, it's also a little bit in dynamic between the different areas in the world, and maybe this is now the role of Europe. And I think the Data Protection Act, also coming from Europe, was the first step to show that we can help to find sensible rules for the internet, and maybe now we have the next step. And I think that's the normal procedure, and it's also normal that democracy needs some minutes to find a solution, but I'm also sure that we will find it. And if we have found it, then I'm also very optimistic that we can execute it.
That's nice to hear. Let's ask a question then to Vice President. We have a question that's just come through for us. What is the motivation behind spreading disinformation about the COVID vaccine? Do EU states need to achieve herd immunity after the release of the vaccine?
What is the motivation? I was carefully listening and hoping that I will get the answer from Mr. Wassermann, who disappeared from the debate. We have several studies which show some statistics that the disinformation flies, I don't know, 6, 7 times quicker than the boring truths or just facts. And the fact that disinformation make people fear, that they increase adrenaline, they increase their conviction that everything always has to go wrong. You know, this kind of psychology makes it fly quicker and unfortunately also sell better. And that's our very long debate with the platforms, that we do not want them to offer the space for those who produce this information to make money on it. And that's why I like to see now the reaction of big business, of the advertisers, that they do not want to connect their brands with fake news and with hate speech, for instance. But if you allow me, where is the line between the facts and opinions? This will be our leading principle in European Democracy Action Plan, because we really do not want to regulate the content, but we want to bring clarity into that sphere, that in our view, the facts are objective and collectively shared and collective ownership, while opinions are private. They belong to individuals. They are possible and needed maybe to challenge. They should be invitation to the public debate and so on. So the line between facts and opinions should be defined, and we will try to do that. We will try to do it right, because you ask about why digital sphere was not regulated over decades. Well, I have myself the impression that over 2 decades we didn't try to touch it because it was a kind of untouchable holy cow, and some impression was created that the sphere of digital platforms should be the sphere without the law, but it's not. It should not be like that. But we do not want to create specific digital law for everything. But as you know, Europe created the very, very well-functioning rules for protecting privacy of people. And now we will try to come with meaningful and feasible solutions for the digital content, including disinformation. I believe that Europe has a healthy instinct on the as a response to the risks which we see coming from digital world. And if I may add last thing, I think it's also because Europe has now the countries like, for instance, my country, which experienced not so long ago one official truth, one official doctrine, which was imposed. Everybody who said something else was sanctioned. And even Václav Havel, who is in the picture behind me, when he became the president, he didn't preach the only official truth. It was the start of plurality of opinions, and we have to keep it in Europe.
Let me just ask Tobias Schmid this question, which comes from Janet in the US. There were big protests in Berlin the other day. Do you have any insight into whether foreign agents may have played a role in mobilizing those protesters too?
No, I do not have this information. No, we do not have. But it leads me to another point, and I think this is also important because we have discussed so much the influence from foreign services in Europe, and of course that's a problem, or obviously it seems to be. But, and I think this is also important, we also have got to see that, of course, disinformation not only comes from external institutions. So the monitoring of ERGA, the European Regulator Group for Audiovisual Media, also showed that we have the tendency that, so to say, the presence of some kinds of political direction in the online environment is getting more present than the relevance of this party has in reality. And that we have also here, maybe not disinformation in the sense that information are wrong, but again, this effect that some opinions are, so to say, getting in relevance and virtual relevance that doesn't exist in reality. This is a phenomenon that we have seen in our survey in Germany, in Italy, and also in Hungary. And this is, again, of course, there's the question, where comes the money from, and is this from external institutions? Can be, but I just would like to underline that I think that we've got to be careful that we are not only talking about influence from outside, but that is information is also something that exists in the different nations, also the European societies, and that we also have got to find answers here. And that's why I again agree to the idea of the Commission to say we've got to be, so to say, neutral and abstract to see what are the mechanisms we've got to intervene against it, and not so much get concentrated on the content. But this is just another aspect. Coming back to your question, no, we do not know. We as media regulators for sure not. I think there we have other services in Germany that could be better informed on that if there is something to be informed about.
Mr. Wassermann, you've just joined us again. We had technical problems before. Tell us about your study, Motivations for Sharing Misinformation.
Well, I think what is interesting from our study, we've done several rounds of study now in various sub-Saharan African countries. And what we've seen here is some similarities with other countries around the world. Some of the motivations, for instance, have to do with people's desire to connect with others, to share their feelings and express their feelings. And some of that is, of course, especially pertinent now in the coronavirus crisis, where people have high levels of anxiety. They need connection, they need support and reassurance. But some of it also has to do with a misplaced sense of civic duty. So if there is a warning coming through social media, be careful of 5G towers or be careful of some conspiracy theory, then people are likely to share it because they want to warn others, even if they don't believe it themselves. And I think that is an important finding because it shows us that if we want to counter misinformation, Regulation and these laws are very important. Platform regulation, the regulation by the platforms like Twitter and Facebook and so on themselves, these are important. But we also have to empower people to be critical of the information they receive. Media literacy campaigns are very important. And we have to try and understand what people's social and cultural conditions and environments are that are conducive to the growing and the sharing of this misinformation.
Mr. Wassermann, while I've got you there, I just wanted to ask you, recent discourses on fake news have given authorities a new opportunity to restrict freedom of expression on social media, particularly on Facebook and WhatsApp. That's a quote from your study. How do you strike the right balance?
Yes, I think that is a very difficult question. In some countries, like my own country, South Africa, misinformation around the coronavirus has been criminalized. And while one can understand maybe the driver for this, and governments are fearful of this disinformation spreading, it is also very dangerous and very problematic, especially in countries where there is already restrictions in place and where there are governments that are authoritative or repressive. So the balance, I think, for me, is to inform and to empower citizens themselves to make these decisions, to be very wary of the information they receive, so as not to criminalize information and stamp out freedom of speech, but to make people more aware of the information, more critical of the information, and less willing to share information unless they have verified this. And it is also important, I think, to support and encourage established media, legitimate and authoritative media, to respond to the needs of citizens so that people know where to turn to if they don't know what the correct information is.
A very good message to end on. We're all part of the system, that's for sure, and one opinion can suddenly become the opinion of millions. Thank you very much for the debate and lively discussion on the battle for information control in Europe. And thanks to our viewers for your questions and comments. Please join us again for the next digital session of the Global Media Forum on September 21st, when we'll be looking at the power that influencers have on social media and what that means for democracy. My name is Ben Fajzullin. It was a pleasure to be your host today. See you next time.